I never thought a routine repair call would flip my world upside down. But when a 25-year-old handyman walked into my home, everything changed. His confident steps, lingering gazes, and unexpected charm awakened a side of me I'd buried long ago. What started with a broken faucet quickly turned into a moment I couldn't resist. Was it destiny, or a mistake I'd regret forever? Life had settled into a rhythm of silence and routine after my husband's passing. At 60 years old, I had resigned myself to the predictable monotony of lonely mornings, quiet afternoons, and restless nights. My home, once filled with laughter and companionship, had become a place where echoes of the past lingered, each creak of the floorboards reminding me of what I had lost. I wasn't unhappy, but I wasn't truly living either. I spent my days tending to small chores, watching TV shows I wasn't really interested in, and occasionally calling my daughter just to feel a connection. My world had shrunk to a manageable, safe bubble of predictability. That is, until a plumbing issue disrupted the rhythm. The broken faucet in my bathroom seemed like another small annoyance in a long string of inconveniences. I'd picked a name from the directory without thinking much of it. When I heard his voice on the phone, calm, steady, and with a confidence that belied his age, I felt a flicker of curiosity. But it was fleeting, a mere moment of distraction from my otherwise uneventful life. When the doorbell rang that morning, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The young man standing on my doorstep didn't look like the typical plumber I had imagined. He was tall, with a strong, athletic build that made his presence feel larger than life. His energy seemed to radiate into the dull space around him, and for the first time in years, my heart beat just a little faster. He introduced himself as Jake, his voice warm yet professional. His easy smile put me at ease, but something about him unsettled me too. Maybe it was his youth, a stark contrast to the world I had grown accustomed to. Or perhaps it was the way he moved, with a confidence that seemed to fill the room. As I led him to the bathroom, I caught myself stealing glances at him. I scolded myself for it. This was ridiculous. He was here to fix a faucet, nothing more. But even as he knelt to examine the pipes, something inside me stirred, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. The repair should have been routine, a quick fix, a polite thank you, and a return to normalcy. But as Jake worked, I found myself unable to ignore the growing tension in the room. There was something about him, a quiet magnetism that made it impossible to look away. He moved with precision, his hands deftly maneuvering around the old pipes, but it was the way his muscles flexed under his shirt that caught my attention. I tried to convince myself it was harmless curiosity. After all, it had been years since I'd shared a home, let alone a moment, with someone so full of energy and life. But the longer he stayed, the harder it became to brush aside the strange pull I felt toward him. At first, I attributed my restlessness to loneliness. Maybe I was overthinking it. But then there were the moments, the fleeting glances, the way his voice softened when he asked for a towel, and the way his hand brushed mine as I handed it to him. Each interaction seemed to hold a weight I couldn't explain. I found myself lingering in the bathroom, pacing aimlessly, my hands nervously clutching the edges of the countertop. "Not many young plumbers out there," I said, my voice awkwardly breaking the silence. He glanced back at me over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. "How long have you been doing this?" "About 5 years," he replied, his tone steady but clipped, as though trying to keep the conversation purely professional. Yet when our eyes met, there was a flicker of something, hesitation, curiosity, or maybe something more. I pressed on, my voice betraying a nervous excitement. "You look too young to have been doing this for so long." His lips twitched into a faint smile, but he didn't respond. Instead, he focused on the task at hand, his silence both intriguing and frustrating. The air between us grew heavier with each passing moment. When he finally finished and stood up, his tall frame seemed to fill the small space of the bathroom. "All done," he said, his voice low and measured. "If there's any more trouble, just give me a call." I should have left it at that. I should have thanked him and let him walk out the door. But something inside me refused to let go. "Would you like some coffee before you go?" I asked, my words tumbling out faster than I could stop them. His pause was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. A brief hesitation before he shook his head politely. "Thanks, but I've got other jobs to get to," he said, his tone firm but kind. He slung his toolbox over his shoulder and headed for the door. As he left, I couldn't help but notice the way he glanced back, just for a moment before stepping out. That night, I replayed every detail in my mind, analyzing each look, each word, as though searching for hidden meaning. Was it all in my head? Or had there been something unsaid lingering between us? I told myself it didn't matter. It had been a moment, nothing more. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The next morning, when the faucet started leaking again, my heart raced as I dialed his number. Was it really about the repair? Or was I just making an excuse to see him again? When he answered, his voice steady and professional, I felt both nervous and excited. "I think the faucet's acting up again," I said, trying to sound casual. "Could you come take another look?" There was a pause on the other end, long enough to make my heart skip a beat. "I'll be there in an hour," he said finally, and as I hung up, a thrill of anticipation coursed through me. This wasn't just about the faucet anymore. Something had shifted, and I wasn't sure I wanted to stop it. When Jake arrived, the energy between us was palpable, almost stifling. I had told myself to act normal, to focus on the broken faucet, but the moment I opened the door and saw him standing there, toolbox in hand, all my resolve crumbled. His eyes flickered over me briefly, just a second too long, before he stepped inside. I had chosen my favorite outfit that morning, something casual yet flattering. I told myself it was to feel confident, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. As he walked past me into the house, his presence filled the room in a way I couldn't ignore. His steady demeanor only heightened the strange mixture of curiosity and attraction bubbling inside me. We walked to the bathroom in silence, the tension between us hanging thick in the air. Jake knelt down by the sink, his strong hands moving with purpose as he inspected the pipes. I stood nearby, pretending to tidy up the counter, but my eyes kept drifting to him. The way his shirt clung to his back, the way his hands worked with such confidence, it was mesmerizing. "Does this happen often?" I asked, trying to make conversation, though my voice came out softer than I intended. He looked up at me briefly, his expression guarded. "Not usually. Must be something tricky with the system here." I nodded, biting my lip to stop myself from saying anything else. But my thoughts were racing. I was hyper-aware of every small movement, every glance he stole when he thought I wasn't looking. There was an unspoken tension building, one that neither of us seemed willing or able to address. As he worked, I found myself moving closer, standing just a bit too near. When I reached for a towel from the cabinet, my hand brushed against his arm. The contact was brief but electric, sending a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. His body tensed, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he paused for a moment before resuming his work, his jaw tightening as though he was trying to suppress something. "I really appreciate you coming back so quickly," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's hard to find someone as reliable as you." He glanced up at me again, this time holding my gaze for a fraction longer than he should have. "Just doing my job," he replied, his tone clipped but not unkind. The air between us grew heavier with each passing second. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as I leaned against the counter, watching him. The small bathroom felt impossibly small, the space between us charged with an intensity that was almost unbearable. At one point, he straightened up, wiping his hands on a cloth. He was standing so close now that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. It was as if time had stopped, the weight of the unspoken words between us pressing down on the room. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant, breaking the silence. I nodded, though my breath hitched slightly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a bit distracted." He didn't ask what I meant, but I saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Hesitation, curiosity, maybe even longing. It was like he was fighting an internal battle, one he wasn't sure he could win. As he turned back to the sink, I found myself stepping closer again, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne. Without thinking, I reached out and lightly touched his shoulder. He froze, his body going rigid under my hand. "Jake," I said softly, my voice trembling. "I don't know why, but I feel like we're both pretending this isn't happening." He turned to face me then, his expression a mix of conflict and something deeper, something raw. "Mrs. Carter," he began, but his voice faltered. He looked down as if searching for the right words, before meeting my gaze again. "We shouldn't." I took a step closer, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "Maybe we shouldn't," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But that doesn't mean we don't want to." For a moment, neither of us moved. The silence between us crackled with tension, our unspoken desires hanging heavy in the air. Then, as if drawn by some invisible force, he closed the small gap between us. His hand brushed against mine, tentative at first, and then his fingers intertwined with mine. "Mrs. Carter," he murmured, his voice low and conflicted. "I can't." But before he could finish, I leaned in, my lips brushing against his. The kiss was hesitant at first, filled with uncertainty, but it quickly deepened, the passion between us igniting like a spark to dry kindling. All the tension, all the longing that had been building between us, came rushing to the surface, impossible to contain any longer. In that moment, everything else faded away, the faucet, the house, the world outside. It was just us, caught in a whirlwind of emotions we could no longer deny. And as his arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The kiss had ignited something between us that neither of us could stop. It was as if all the walls we had built, all the boundaries we had tried to maintain, crumbled in an instant. Jake's hand slid to my waist, hesitant yet firm, and my fingers tangled in his hair as we stood there, locked in a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. "This isn't right," he whispered against my lips, his voice trembling. But even as he said it, he didn't pull away. Instead, he held me closer, his breath warm against my skin. "We shouldn't be doing this." "I know," I murmured, my voice barely audible. "But I can't stop." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, as if a dam had broken, the tension that had been building between us spilled over. Jake lifted me effortlessly, carrying me out of the bathroom and into the bedroom. The world around us blurred as we moved, our hearts pounding in unison. When we reached the bed, he paused, his gaze searching mine as though looking for some sign that we should stop. But there was no hesitation in my eyes. I wanted this, needed this, in a way I couldn't explain. And so, he lowered me onto the bed, his lips finding mine once more. For what felt like hours, we were lost in each other, a tangle of limbs and emotions. Every touch, every kiss, was electric, awakening a part of me I had long thought dormant. Jake's hands were both gentle and commanding, his movements confident yet tender. I could feel the conflict within him, but it only made our connection more intense. Afterward, we lay tangled together, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. My head rested on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath my ear. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that this could last, that we could exist in this stolen moment forever. But deep down, I knew it wasn't possible. "I shouldn't have let this happen," Jake said finally, his voice filled with regret. I don't know what came over me. I sat up, wrapping the blanket around me as I looked at him. "You don't have to explain," I said softly. "I know this wasn't planned." He ran a hand through his hair, his expression conflicted. "It's not just that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're different. This isn't just about attraction. It's more than that, and it scares me." His words caught me off guard. I had expected him to brush this off, to downplay what had just happened. But instead, he was being vulnerable, admitting to feelings he didn't fully understand. It made my heart ache, even as it filled me with a strange sense of hope. Before either of us could say more, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway shattered the moment. My heart sank as I realized who it was, my daughter, coming by for her weekly visit. Panic set in as I scrambled to gather my clothes, my mind racing with excuses. "You need to go," I said, my voice urgent. "She can't find you here." Jake nodded, quickly pulling on his shirt and jeans. But as he moved toward the door, he hesitated, turning back to look at me. This doesn't feel like a mistake," he said quietly. "I don't know what it is, but it's not nothing." His words left me speechless, and before I could respond, he was gone, slipping out the back door just as my daughter walked through the front. For the rest of the day, I was on edge, my mind replaying every detail of what had happened. I barely registered my daughter's conversation, nodding absently as she talked about her work and her kids. All I could think about was Jake, his touch, his words, the way he had looked at me like I was the only person in the world. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house, my emotions swinging wildly between guilt and longing. Part of me wanted to call him, to hear his voice and know that he felt the same. But another part of me knew I had to let it go, that this could only lead to heartbreak. The next morning, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I avoided the bathroom, unable to face the scene of our indiscretion. But as I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window, I saw his truck pull into the driveway. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched him step out, toolbox in hand. "What are you doing here?" I asked when I opened the door, my voice trembling. He looked at me, his expression both determined and apologetic. "The faucet," he said simply. "I wanted to make sure it's fixed for good this time." I let him in, my emotions swirling as I led him to the bathroom. The tension between us was different now, less charged but no less intense. As he worked, I couldn't help but watch him, my mind replaying the events of the day before. When he finished, he turned to me, his gaze steady. "I meant what I said," he said quietly. "This isn't just some fling for me. I don't know what it is, but I can't just walk away." Tears welled in my eyes as I struggled to find the right words. "Jake, this isn't simple," I said finally. "There's so much at stake, for both of us." "I know," he said, his voice firm. "But I also know that whatever this is, it's real. And I'm willing to figure it out if you are." For a moment I was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Then slowly I nodded. "Okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But we have to be careful." He smiled then, a small, tentative smile that made my heart ache. "Careful," he agreed. "But not afraid." As he left, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. I didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain. It had already changed me in ways I couldn't ignore. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. I tried to settle back into my routine, to convince myself that life could return to normal, but the truth was impossible to ignore. Jake had awakened something in me, and no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, the memory of his touch, his words, lingered in every corner of my mind. Guilt crept in slowly at first, like a shadow lurking at the edges of my thoughts. I replayed every moment we had shared, wondering how I had allowed myself to cross that line. I wasn't just betraying my own values. I was risking everything. What would my daughter think if she knew? My friends, my neighbors? The weight of their potential judgment hung over me like a cloud. And yet, even in the midst of my guilt, there was something else. A spark of defiance, a quiet voice whispering that, for the first time in years, I felt alive. Jake had reminded me of what it meant to be seen, to be desired. But that small ember of joy was quickly overshadowed by the cold reality of what I had done. Jake and I tried to keep our interactions limited to necessary moments. He would stop by to check on the repairs, or bring by a part he had forgotten, each visit shrouded in an unspoken tension. Our conversations were brief and polite, but every glance, every accidental brush of his hand, reignited the fire we were both desperately trying to contain. Then came the first crack in our fragile facade. My daughter stopped by unexpectedly one afternoon, catching Jake just as he was leaving. Her sharp eyes darted between us, her expression puzzled but not yet suspicious. "Who's that?" she asked as the door closed behind him. "Just the plumber," I replied too quickly, my voice higher than usual. "The faucet's been giving me trouble again." She frowned, clearly unconvinced. "Didn't he just fix it last week?" I forced a laugh, waving off her concern. "Old houses, you know how it is." She didn't press further, but the seed of doubt had been planted. I spent the rest of the day on edge, imagining all the ways this could unravel. If my daughter suspected something, it wouldn't take long for the rest of the world to find out. The thought made my chest tighten with fear. The next time Jake came over, I told him we needed to talk. We stood in the kitchen, the tension between us heavier than ever. Whatever this is, it can't continue," I said, my voice breaking. "It's too risky. We're going to get caught." Jake's jaw tightened, his hands clenching at his sides. "Caught by who?" he asked, his tone edged with frustration. "Your daughter? The neighbors? Do you really care what they think?" "Yes," I said firmly, though my heart ached even as I said it. "I've already lost so much. I can't afford to lose what little I have left." His expression softened then, the anger melting into something sadder, more vulnerable. "And what about what you've gained?" he asked quietly. "What about feeling alive again? Doesn't that matter?" It did. Of course it did. But I couldn't admit it, not even to myself. Instead, I shook my head, turning away from him. "It doesn't matter," I said, my voice trembling. "It's not worth the cost." Jake was silent for a long moment before he nodded. "If that's how you feel, I'll respect it," he said finally, though his voice was heavy with disappointment. "But I think you're lying, to yourself more than anyone else." After he left, the house felt emptier than ever. The silence was deafening, every creak of the floorboards a painful reminder of what I had let go. I tried to distract myself with chores, with TV, with anything that would keep my mind occupied. But nothing worked. Jake's absence was a physical ache, one I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. The following week, my daughter confronted me. "Mom, is there something going on with you and that plumber?" she asked, her tone both concerned and accusatory. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Of course not," I said quickly, too quickly. "Why would you think that?" She crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. "Because you've been acting strange lately. And because I saw the way he looked at you." Her words cut deeper than I expected, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. I had been fooling myself, thinking I could keep this secret hidden. But the truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how deeply it was buried. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said finally, my voice shaky. "You're imagining things." She didn't push further, but the doubt in her eyes was unmistakable. And as she left, I realized that no matter how careful I tried to be, the consequences of my actions were already unfolding. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring out the window at the empty street. The weight of everything, my guilt, my longing, my fear, pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. I thought about Jake, about the way he had looked at me, the way he had made me feel. And I wondered if I would ever feel that way again. But more than anything, I wondered if it had been worth it. The days turned into weeks, and life seemed to settle back into its old, predictable rhythm. Jake stopped coming around, and I forced myself to stay away from the bathroom, as if avoiding the place could erase what had happened there. But nothing could erase it. The memories were burned into my mind, vivid and unrelenting. I tried to convince myself that I had made the right decision. Ending whatever it was that had started between Jake and me was the only way to protect the life I'd built, fragile as it was. But the emptiness that followed was more profound than I'd expected. It was as if I had tasted something forbidden, something I hadn't realized I was starving for, and now nothing else could satisfy that hunger. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The loneliness that had crept in after my husband's passing, the way I had buried myself in routines and distractions to avoid confronting the void in my life. Jake hadn't created that void. He had only revealed it, pulling back the layers I had worked so hard to build. I couldn't stop wondering, was what I did unforgivable? Was it selfish to have allowed myself even a moment of happiness, no matter how fleeting or complicated? The questions weighed heavily on me, but I found no easy answers. The next time my daughter visited, she brought it up again, her tone softer this time. "Mom, I just want you to be honest with me," she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. "If there's something going on, you don't have to hide it. I'm not here to judge you." Her words surprised me, breaking through the wall I had been trying to maintain. For a moment, I considered telling her everything, laying bare the truth of what had happened. But instead, I chose a version of the truth that felt safer. "I've just been lonely," I said, my voice quiet but steady. "And sometimes it's hard to know how to handle that." She reached across the table, taking my hand in hers. "It's okay to feel that way," she said. "But you don't have to go through it alone. I'm here, Mom. Always." Her reassurance brought a flicker of comfort, but it didn't erase the ache inside me. It didn't erase Jake. That night, I sat in my bedroom, staring at my reflection in the mirror. The woman who looked back at me seemed older, wearier, but also wiser. I had made mistakes, yes. But I had also rediscovered a part of myself that I thought was gone forever. The part that could feel deeply, that could crave connection and passion. In the weeks that followed, I began to focus on rebuilding my life, this time with more intention. I reached out to old friends, joined a local book club, and even started volunteering at a community center. These small steps didn't fill the void entirely, but they reminded me that there were ways to find connection without crossing boundaries I wasn't willing to break again. And yet, Jake remained a part of me. Not in the way he had been during those stolen moments, but as a memory, a reminder of the lessons I had learned. He had shown me that I was still capable of feeling alive, of taking risks, even if those risks came with consequences. The moral of my story wasn't clear-cut, nor was it meant to be. Life is messy, filled with moments of weakness and strength, of regret and growth. What mattered most was what I chose to do next, how I used those moments to shape the person I wanted to be. As I sat on my porch one quiet evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I found a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be learned from. And in that learning, I found a sliver of hope. Hope that, despite everything, there was still a chance to move forward. If you've ever faced a moment where your heart and mind were at war, what would you do? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that dive deep into the complexities of love, betrayal, and redemption. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. It's a story that will leave you speechless.